skill mismatch is a very general term that describes frictions between the skills and competencies that workers have to offer and the skills and competencies that firms demand. It does encompass a number of different forms of frictions that are, some are independent and others are related to each other, but all have the potential to have negative impacts for workers, for firms and the wider economy. So from the perspective of the worker, the skill mismatches that we hear about most are vertical mismatches. These are where workers are perceived to have too little or not enough human capital for the requirements of their jobs. So one main form of vertical mismatch would be overeducation and undereducation. Then we have the concept of horizontal mismatch. This would be a worker that is working in a job that is unrelated to where they were trained. For example, a scientist or an engineer working as a librarian, they would be horizontally mismatched. And if we think of someone whose job has been replaced by technology, so a bank teller whose job has now become automated, that's economic obsolescence. And that's a form of skill mismatch that we worry a lot about, particularly due to technological change and AI. From the perspective of firms, we hear of two main forms of skill mismatch. Skill shortages. This is where the firms say they cannot find the people that they need to hire to fill new posts because of a lack of qualified candidates. And then skill gaps, where the employer said, well, my current employees don't have the right skills to do the job competently that I need them to do. In terms of the costs that arise from skill mismatches, they can be very significant for both workers and firms, as I have said, but the nature of the costs and who bears them will probably differ somewhat depending on the form of skill mismatch that we're talking about. So skill shortages have the potential to increase hiring costs, which lower profitability and also negatively impact productivity. So with vertical mismatches, those costs can potentially be borne by both workers and employers. If we look at the studies that have been published over the last 15 years, there's been about 250 studies on areas of skill mismatch, but around 150 of those have been studies of overeducation. Around 3% of the evidence base is on the issue of skill shortages. It's not the case that researchers believe that overeducation is a big problem and that skill shortages are not. It's just that there are big data constraints out there. So what we do know from the evidence, around 1 in 4 workers are deemed to have surplus human capital. They're either overeducated or overskilled. So that's potentially an awful lot of lost productivity in the economy where people are performing well below their optimum because they're not in jobs that suit their education and skills. There may not be as big of a productivity loss to the aggregate economy from having too few skills and competencies as opposed to having too many. We need to be very careful when we're talking about skill shortages. One study, for example, that was published some years ago at a European level found that 47% of firms at an EU level said that they had problems recruiting graduates. However, when the researchers looked below the surface of that data, they found that probably only just over about 10% of those apparent skill shortages were genuine skill shortages. The majority of them were generated either by the firm not offering the market wage or by inefficient hiring practices and HR practices. So that's the evidence base is very skewed in one sense. And that leads us to a slight paradox, because when we look at what governments do to try and tackle issues of skill shortages, and we look at all the policies that are out there, those policies are very heavily concentrated towards tackling skill shortages and skill gaps. And we see no policies really attempting to tackle these vertical mismatches of overeducation or overskilling. That is a general misconception that is out there. It used to be the case, for example, in the UK, where just around 10% of people went to university and got a university qualification. That's up at around 50% and over now. And that's typical for most European countries. So it's not the case that the solution is simply to reduce or curtail the number of higher education or university places. It's much more complex than that. I have said that over-education, for example, is not being driven by having too many graduates coming onto the labour market or too rapidly expanding the university sector. But that's not to say that universities don't have an important role to play, because a lot of the mismatches that we see out there are due to information asymmetries, where the workers don't have enough information about the employers and vice versa. So our research has found that the greater the practical components within a degree programme, so the greater the emphasis, for example, on problem-based learning, on the emphasis on giving the students practical facts and knowledge, on research projects, then the less likely it is that the student will ultimately end up mismatched. We really don't know an awful lot about the role of these demand-side factors, employer factors, in driving skill mismatches. We might think that skill mismatches would vary depending on how labour is organised within firms. For example, do firms that have lots of team working have lower levels of mismatch than firms that, say, have lots of workers doing solitary, repetitive tasks? Is it the case that job quality is important? There's this assumption that job quality has been rising in labour markets over time. It's not clear that that's actually the case. If we think about the contractual relationships that are within organisations, there's a key question. Is it the case that mismatches are lower in firms that offer more permanent contracts compared to firms that tend to rely more on temporary contracts or zero-hour contracts? What is the role, for example, in terms of the recruitment practices of firms and the HR practices of firms? Do they also drive mismatches? Also, issues like the skill sets of managers, are they important in determining skill mismatches? And also in terms of flexible working arrangements, particularly that facilitate women to maintain occupational status without having to downgrade for family reasons, there's a good reason to believe that those firms would also have lower levels of mismatch. But that's all hypothesizing. We really need data to answer those questions. What we really need going forward is data sets that include information on workers and on firms, so we can see how important are the firm components in terms of driving skill mismatches, how do they interact with the worker elements, and only then can we really develop informed policies in tackling skill mismatches, particularly in terms of the firm side of the equation. Really, the provision of data sets like that are the responsibility of national governments and we would also say the European Commission, for example, at an EU level. So the data sets that we need are called linked employer-employee data sets. They do exist out there for a very small number of countries, so we know how to build the data. Ideally, we want to have that over time, so we want it to have a longitudinal component. So what are the barriers? The barriers could be twofold. Obviously, there's a cost associated with that, but given the overall scale of the costs that skill mismatches can incur in economies, I'd say that's pretty minimal. Productivity drives everything. Productivity is important for determining individuals' earnings, for determining firms' profitability, for determining tax revenues, and then therefore determine the extent to which governments can provide key services like education and health. So when we looked at the study comparing productivity in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, we found that at around 2000, productivity levels between the two regions were broadly the same. But 20 years later, productivity levels in the Republic of Ireland were around 40% higher than those in the Republic of Ireland. That's a massively worrying gap. And it's not actually the case that that has been driven by massive productivity growth in the Republic, driven by what we call the Celtic Tiger phenomenon. What we've been finding is that gap has been driven by productivity levels actually falling over time in Northern Ireland. What are the drivers of that? Well, productivity is generally driven by a few key things. Human capital, the education and skill levels of your workers, the quality of your infrastructure, and things like the export orientation of your firms and foreign direct investment. And when we looked at the data, we found that there are big gaps in those areas between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. The educational training system in the Republic is now significantly better than those of Northern Ireland. Early school leaving, for example, is 2 to 3 times higher in Northern Ireland than in the Republic. When we look at the upper end of the spectrum, around 60% of young people in the Republic of Ireland are qualified to the 2 highest levels of education. That's 40% in Northern Ireland. So there's big gaps there. There's gaps, obviously, in terms of infrastructure, and the foreign direct investment is much more intensive, and exports are much more intensive in the Republic of Ireland. So when we put human capital and infrastructure into the model, we can predict the productivity levels in the Republic of Ireland. When we do that for Northern Ireland, the models don't work. It's not going to be sufficient to redress the education gaps, will not be the answer to necessarily increasing productivity in Northern Ireland, that there's something more fundamentally problematic with the underlying competitiveness of the Northern Ireland economy that will take a very high levels of investment and a more integrated approach in terms of policy to try and solve that going forward. So it's a big problem. My main message, again, is that you need to invest in the data infrastructure. The obvious question is, how can you design policies to reduce the negative impacts of anything if you don't know what's causing that phenomenon in the first place?